He slammed the advertisement onto the counter so hard the ink jar rattled. "A foreign girl," Mayor Aldrich Holt said, his voice low and deliberate, the kind of voice that didn't ask. It decided. "Living in your house, under your roof. Oof. You want to be the joke of this county, Kane?" Everett didn't answer. He was already folding the telegram. "I'm telling you," Holt continued, leaning in close enough that Everett could smell the whiskey on his breath at 9 in the morning. "If you bring that woman here, I will make it my personal business to see she doesn't stay." Everett looked at him for a long moment. Then he put on his hat. "Then I guess you'll be busy," he said. What happened next would change both of their lives in ways that neither of them, not the stubborn marshal, not the frightened young woman stepping off a train with one bag and a broken past, could have imagined. If this story moves you, subscribe and hit the bell. I want you here for every chapter. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. And if you believe in second chances, press that like button before we begin. The advertisement had been Everett Kane's idea, and from the moment he'd mailed it, he'd regretted it. Not because it was wrong. He needed help. The house was falling apart in the quiet way that houses do when a man spends more time on horseback than inside his own walls. Dishes stacking up, firewood uncut, a back bedroom that hadn't been opened in 3 years because he didn't see the point. He was 51 years old, a marshal in Harland Ridge, Wyoming, and he had lived alone for so long that silence had stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like furniture, just something that was there. But the advertisement, housekeeper needed, winter season, room and board provided, respond to Marshall E. Kane, Harland Ridge. That had been a different kind of admission. It was the kind of thing a man posted when he could no longer pretend he was managing fine. He told himself it was practical. He got one response. The letter came from Chicago. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had learned English as a second language and was determined not to make mistakes. Her name was Anya Novak. She was 29. She had worked as a domestic in 2 households, one in Warsaw and one in Chicago, and the Chicago position had ended. She didn't say how, and something in the careful blankness of that sentence told Everett not to push. She said she was experienced, she was hardworking, and she needed the work. She did not ask what kind of man he was. She did not ask what the house looked like or what the town was like. She just said she needed the work. Something about that had bothered Everett more than anything else in the letter, not because it was alarming, because it was familiar. He sent the train fare. The morning she was due to arrive, Everett woke up before dawn with the particular kind of dread that has nothing to do with danger and everything to do with not knowing what to say to another human being. He'd handled outlaws with less anxiety than he felt pulling on his coat that morning. He was a man who was comfortable with silence and comfortable with authority, but he was not, and had never been, comfortable with the specific social requirement of making a stranger feel welcome. He drove the wagon to the station alone. He didn't ask anyone to come with him. He didn't want witnesses to whatever awkward thing the first 5 minutes were going to be. The train was 40 minutes late. He waited on the platform in the cold, hat pulled low, hands in his coat pockets, watching the horizon for smoke. The temperature had been dropping since the previous afternoon, and the sky had the particular gray-white look that old-timers in this part of Wyoming called a warning sky. The first major storm of the season was coming. How soon was the question? When the train finally appeared and ground to a slow stop, Everett straightened and watched the doors. 3 people got off. A traveling salesman with 2 trunks. A young man who looked like he was coming home for the holidays and was already regretting it. And then, a woman. She was small. That was the first thing he noticed. Not because he'd expected someone larger, but because everything about the way she stepped off that train suggested that she'd spent a long time making herself as small as possible. She had dark hair pinned back severely, a coat that had been good quality once, and now was simply warm enough, and she was carrying one leather bag. Not a trunk, not a case. One bag, held with both hands, pressed against her front like something she was protecting. She looked at the platform, and then she looked at the men on it, and her face did something that Everett recognized immediately. It went professionally neutral. Not cold, not unfriendly, just carefully, deliberately blank. The face of someone who had learned that showing what you were feeling in front of strangers was a risk you couldn't always afford. He walked toward her. "Miss Novak." She turned. Her eyes were dark and direct, and they assessed him in about 3 seconds in a way that was so quick and so thorough that he almost felt like he'd been frisked. She was looking at his badge, his coat, his hands, his face. Not in the order most people looked. In the order of someone who was checking whether she was safe. Marshall Kane, she said. Her accent was there, not heavy, but present. The kind that said, English is my second language, and I've been speaking it long enough to be fluent, but not long enough to forget what it cost me to learn. Train was late, he said. Yes. A pause. I apologize. He almost said that's not something you need to apologize for, but he caught it. Instead, he just said, wagons out front, and picked up her bag before she could protest. She didn't say thank you. She fell into step beside him, and the silence between them was not comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who were both smart enough to know that they didn't know each other yet. The ride back to the house took 40 minutes. They spoke maybe 60 words total. He told her about the layout of the house, what he needed from a housekeeper, what the schedule generally looked like. She asked two questions, both practical. Where was the water supply drawn from, and was there a root cellar? He answered both. And then they were quiet again, and the sky got grayer and grayer overhead, and by the time the house came into view, the first flakes were starting to fall. He stopped the wagon in front, and they sat there for a moment looking at it. He knew what it looked like. He wasn't sentimental about it. It was a house that needed work, that had been maintained well enough to be functional and not well enough to be anything else. The porch railing on the left side had pulled loose from its post. There were shutters that needed repainting. The woodpile on the north side was lower than it should be for this point in the season. He waited for her to say something. He wasn't sure what he expected. Disappointment, maybe, or the careful politeness of someone who was trying not to show disappointment. She got down from the wagon. The woodpile is low, she said. I know. Will you be able to get more before the storm? He looked at the sky. I'll go out this afternoon. She nodded, picked up her bag from the wagon bed, and walked up the porch steps. She tried the door. It was unlocked. He never locked it, didn't see the point when the closest neighbor was half a mile away. She went inside, and he sat in the wagon for a moment, listening to the sound of her footsteps moving through the house, slow and deliberate, taking inventory. He told himself this was a practical arrangement. He told himself that 6 weeks from now she would move on, he would be alone again, and things would go back to normal. He didn't examine why that thought felt less appealing than it should have. He unhitched the horse and went to cut wood. The first week was hard, in the way that all first weeks are hard. Not because anything went wrong exactly, but because the presence of another person in a space that has been silent for a long time is its own kind of disruption, even when that person is quiet. Anya Novak was extremely quiet. Not shy. There was nothing shy about her. She was precise and economical with both her words and her movements. And she learned the layout of the house with a speed that Everett found slightly unnerving, as though she had been cataloging it the whole time and simply waited until she had the complete picture before she started adjusting things. And she did adjust things. Carefully. Not dramatically. She wasn't rearranging furniture or changing what things looked like. But dishes appeared in different places after she washed them, places that made more sense. The firewood was stacked differently, more tightly, in a way that took up less space. A pot he'd had sitting on a high shelf for 3 years, unused, showed up clean on the stovetop, and the first evening she used it to make soup from dried beans and salt pork, and something she'd apparently brought in her bag. A paper twist of herbs that made the house smell like something entirely different from what it had smelled like before. He came in from a long day dealing with a property dispute on the east side of the territory, cold and tired and ready for whatever was edible, and he walked into that smell and stopped in the doorway. She was at the stove with her back to him. She said without turning around, 15 minutes. He hung up his coat and sat at the table and watched her work, and he thought, not for the first time that week, that there was something unresolved about her that he couldn't put his finger on, something in the set of her shoulders. Not fear exactly, more like the particular tension of someone who was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I understood that tension. He'd felt it himself for years after the accident, that particular anticipation of disaster that doesn't go away just because the disaster is already over. The soup was good, better than anything he'd made for himself in years, and he was not a man who couldn't cook, so that was saying something. He told her so because it seemed dishonest not to. She said, "The herbs are old. I'll need to replace them when I can get to town." "Write me a list," he said. She looked at him across the table. "You don't need to go into town for me." I go into town every week, he said. Write me a list. She wrote him a list. That was how trust started, in his experience. Not with declarations, but with lists. With practical, mundane evidence that the other person was paying attention. It was the 5th day when he first heard her crying. He hadn't meant to hear it. He'd come back to the house in the middle of the afternoon because his horse had thrown a shoe on the road south of the property line, and he'd walked the mare back and was coming through the back door, which he rarely used, quietly, because he didn't want to startle anyone. He heard it through the wall, the sound of someone crying who was trying not to be heard, that particular stifled, controlled quality of grief that's harder to listen to than full-throated sobbing, because you can hear how much effort it's taking to contain it. He stood in the back hallway for 30 seconds. He thought about going in. He thought about saying something. He went to the barn instead, found the spare shoe, and spent an hour on the mare's hoof. When he came back inside, Anya was making dinner, her face composed, her eyes a little pink, but otherwise giving nothing away. I came back early, he said. Horse threw a shoe. Is she all right? Fine. He hung up his coat. Smells good. Potato soup. A pause. I found potatoes in the cellar. There are quite a few. Someone stocked it well. That was my wife, he said. He hadn't meant to say that. He hadn't talked about Margaret to anyone in 3 years, not because it was a secret, but because it hadn't come up, and he hadn't made it come up. The word just arrived. He stood there for a moment, slightly surprised at himself. Anya didn't turn around. She didn't say I'm sorry or what happened or any of the things people said when they wanted to know more but were pretending they were offering condolences. She said she knew what she was doing, which was the most exactly right thing to say, and she probably didn't even know that. He sat down. He said, yes, she did. And that was all. And dinner was quiet and warm, and outside the wind was picking up again. And in that particular evening, Everett Kane felt something shift very slightly in his chest. Not dramatically, not like a revelation, but like a piece of furniture that had been in the wrong position for years and had finally, almost accidentally, been nudged to where it actually belonged. The storm that had been threatening since Anya's first day finally arrived on the 9th night. Not a warning storm. The real thing. By morning, the temperature had dropped to 20 below and the snow was coming down sideways, and Harlan Ridge was effectively cut off from the surrounding territory. Everett had been through enough Wyoming winters to know that cut off didn't mean still. It meant the opposite. Cut off meant disputes over shared fences where the boundary markers were buried in 3 feet of snow. It meant cattle wandering and people making bad decisions out of cabin fever, and everyone becoming a slightly worse version of themselves under the pressure of cold and proximity. He told Anya over breakfast that he might be gone for long stretches. He told her where the extra lamp oil was and where he kept the emergency supplies, and that if anything went wrong, she should ride to the Carmichael place 2 miles east before she tried to handle anything herself. She listened. She said, I understand. And then, will you eat before you go? He almost said he'd eat on the road. He stopped himself. Yeah, he said, I'll eat. She made eggs and cornbread, and he ate standing at the counter because he was already half in his coat, and she didn't comment on that, and he was grateful. He was almost out the door when he heard her say, quietly, almost to herself, be careful. He turned. She was washing the pan back to him, and she didn't look up. He stood there for a second. I will, he said. He meant it more than he usually did when people said that to him. Oh. The first real trouble with the town came on a Thursday, the second week of the storm. He'd been in dealing with a livestock dispute when he stopped in at Peters General to pick up the supplies from Anya's list. And Dorothy Peters, whose store had functioned as the social beating heart of Harlan Ridge for 22 years, mostly because she was constitutionally incapable of not sharing information, said, in a tone she probably thought was casual, I hear you've got a foreign girl staying out at your place. I have a housekeeper, Everett said. He put Anya's list on the counter. I heard she came from Poland. Dorothy began pulling items off the shelf, not looking at him. That's quite a ways to come for housekeeping work. People go where the work is, Everett said. That's how it works. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. Dorothy said this in the specific tone people use when they are absolutely implying there is something wrong with it. I'm just saying folks are curious. Folks can be curious, he said. That doesn't mean they get answers. He paid for the supplies. He picked up the box. Dorothy called after him, almost gently, You just be careful, Everett. A man in your position. People talk. He stopped at the door. He thought about turning around. He thought about saying several things. He thought about the sound of Anya crying through a wall, trying not to be heard, on her 5th day in a house that wasn't hers, in a town that hadn't even looked at her before deciding it didn't want her. Let them, he said, and walked out into the cold. He didn't look back. He drove home thinking about the expression on Dorothy's face. Not malicious, not exactly. Just that particular breed of small-town certainty that assumes things it shouldn't because it's never been asked not to. He'd seen it before. He'd dealt with it before. It still settled in his gut like a stone. When he got home, Anya was mending one of his shirts at the kitchen table, working by lamplight, and the house smelled like she'd been baking. He set the box on the counter without saying anything, and she looked at the contents and said, "Thank you, that's everything." "Dorothy Peters asked about you," he said. He wasn't sure why he was telling her. He felt like she should know. She deserved to know what the temperature was. She kept mending. "What did she say?" "Nothing specific, just questions." "Ah." A pause. She bit off a thread. "What kind of town is it?" He sat down across from her. He thought about it honestly. "It's a decent town," he said, "with a few people in it who've decided that decent means familiar. Those aren't the same thing, but not everybody figures that out." She looked up at him then. It was the most directly she'd looked at him since the train platform. "I know the type," she said. "I imagine you do," he said. They sat there for a moment in the lamplight, the storm pressing against the windows, and Everett felt the weight of everything neither of them had said settle around them like the snow outside. Not oppressive, just present, just the truth of the situation, laid out plainly between two people who were both old enough to recognize the truth when they saw it. "The bread'll be done in 10 minutes, Anya said, looking back at the shirt. "I'll wait," he said. He did. It was the bread, actually, that started to change things in town. He'd brought a wrapped loaf of it to the Hendersons when their youngest came down sick, and Eleanor Henderson was too exhausted to cook. He'd mentioned when Eleanor asked where it came from that Anya had sent it. He'd said it without thinking, the way you mention the name of someone who's just part of the household. Eleanor Henderson had looked at the bread. Then she'd looked at Everett. Then she'd said, "That was kind of her. Not of the foreign girl, not of your housekeeper, of her." The first time anyone in Harland Ridge had used a pronoun that implied Anya Novak was a person rather than a situation. Small thing. But Everett noticed small things. It was most of what his job was. He told Anya that evening, not because he thought she needed reassurance, but because he thought she deserved to know. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How old is the child?" "4, I think, maybe 5. She nodded slowly. "Sick children are the same everywhere," she said. "You don't need to speak the same language to want a child to be warm and fed." He looked at her. "You have a way of cutting to the center of things," he said. She almost smiled. It was the closest she'd come to smiling in nearly 2 weeks, and it changed her face so completely and so briefly that he felt like he'd glimpsed something that wasn't meant for him to see. "My mother said I had a sharp tongue," she said. "I've been trying to soften it." "Don't," he said, without thinking. And then, because he'd said it, he just let it sit there. She looked at him again with those direct, assessing eyes. "All right," she said finally. "I won't." Outside, the wind was still howling. Inside, the bread was warm. And for the first time since the season had begun, Everett Kane felt, with the particular quiet certainty of a man who rarely lets himself feel anything before he's sure, that this winter was going to be different from all the ones that had come before it. He just didn't know yet what that meant. He would. The bread. Eleanor Henderson received on a Tuesday became, by Friday, a subject of conversation at the feed store. Not the bread itself, nobody talked about bread, but the fact that Everett Kane had brought it. That detail traveled the way all small details travel in small towns, which is to say quickly and with elaboration, until by the time it reached Mayor Aldrich Holt's ears, it had apparently transformed into Everett Kane making daily social calls on behalf of his foreign housekeeper. Holt mentioned it to Everett the following Monday outside the jailhouse. In the particular way Holt mentioned things he considered problems, offhandedly, as though it had just occurred to him, as though he hadn't been thinking about it for 3 days. "Heard you've been playing delivery boy for that woman," Holt said. Everett was checking the lock on the jailhouse door, which had been sticking since the cold set in. He didn't look up. I brought a sick family a loaf of bread. People are going to think you're soft, Everett. People think a lot of things. He tried the lock again. It turned. You need something, Aldrich, or are you out here for the cold air? Holt was quiet for a moment in the way that powerful men in small towns get quiet when they realize a conversation is not going the direction they intended. He had a round face that went red easily, from cold, from whiskey, from frustration, and right now it was doing all three. I'm telling you as a friend. I know you think that, Everett said. He meant it honestly. He did not mean it kindly. He went inside and closed the door. He stood in the empty jailhouse for a moment, listening to the wind outside. He thought about what Holt had said, not because it bothered him, or rather, it bothered him in the way that the persistent drip of water bothers you, not because any single drop is significant, but because you know what sustained water does to stone over time. He'd been Marshal of Harland Ridge for 11 years. He'd built something here. Not a monument, nothing like that. Just a reputation for being fair and even-handed, and not beholden to anyone's opinion of what fair and even-handed should look like. He'd maintained that reputation through things that were harder than this. He wasn't going to let it erode over bread. But Holt's words sat in him longer than he wanted them to, which was the real problem, and he knew it. He rode home that evening into a wind that had teeth in it, and when he came through the door, the house was warm in the way it never used to be warm. Not just in temperature, but in something harder to name. There was a smell of something cooking, and a lamp was lit on the table, and Anya was at the counter with her back to him, and he had the sudden disorienting sensation of returning to a place that had, without his permission and without his full awareness, become somewhere he actually wanted to return to. He didn't like how much he didn't mind that. Bad day? She said, without turning around. Manageable, he said. He hung up his coat and his gun belt. How'd you know? You close the door differently when it's bad. She turned. She was holding a wooden spoon and her expression was neutral, but her eyes were not. Sit down. This is almost ready. He sat down. He put his elbows on the table in a way he never did when he was alone because there was no one to do it in front of, and he realized that was a strange thing to notice about himself. Holt came to see me, he said. She set a bowl in front of him. Some kind of stew, thick and dark, with what looked like dried mushrooms he didn't remember having. He looked at it, and then at her. Dorothy Peters gave me mushrooms, she said, before he could ask. 2 days ago, when you took me into town for the mail. She came out when you were at the post office. He absorbed this. You didn't mention that. I didn't think it mattered. She sat across from him with her own bowl. What did Mayor Holt say? He told her, accurately and without editorializing. He watched her face while he did. Her expression didn't change, or rather, it changed in the same controlled, precise way. It always changed when she was processing something she didn't want to react to visibly. A very small tightening around the eyes, a slight stillness in the jaw. He's not going to stop, she said when he finished. No. Does that bother you? He ate a spoonful of stew. It was remarkable. He didn't know what she'd done to it, but the mushrooms had changed everything. It bothers me that it bothers me, he said, which is different. She looked at him across the table. You could tell people I'm not staying past spring, she said carefully. It would make things simpler. He put his spoon down. Are you asking me to do that? No. The word came quickly. Then she caught herself and said it again, more carefully. No, I'm asking if you want to. He picked up his spoon again. I don't want to say things that aren't true. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed against the north wall of the house with a sound like something trying to get in. I don't know yet if I'm staying past spring, she said. I know that. So it might be true. Might, he said, is not definitely. She looked at him for a long moment, and he held her gaze because looking away felt like conceding something. Finally, she said quietly, You're a stubborn man, Marshal Kane. I've been told, he said. She almost smiled. That same brief, almost gone expression he'd seen once before, the one that transformed her face and vanished before you could be sure you'd seen it. He looked back at his stew before she could notice that he'd noticed. They ate the rest of the meal in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the first week. Less careful. Less like two people maintaining a safe distance, and more like two people who had simply run out of words for the moment and didn't feel the need to fill the space. That was its own kind of thing. He'd stopped knowing what to call it and started just letting it be what it was. The mushroom incident, which was what Everett privately called it in his head, knowing it was too small to be called an incident, turned out to be the beginning of something. Dorothy Peters had given Anya mushrooms out a side door of the store while Everett was at the post office, which meant Dorothy Peters had been watching for an opportunity. Which meant Dorothy Peters had changed her mind about something, or at minimum was in the process of changing it, which was a notable event because Dorothy Peters changed her mind about as often as the mountains changed their positions. It started small. A woman named Bess Larkin came to the door one afternoon when Everett was out on patrol, and Anya answered it, and Bess Larkin's youngest had a cough that had been worrying her for a week. Bess was 32, the wife of the blacksmith, and she had 5 children and the particular exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a losing battle against winter illness for the past month. She looked at Anya on the doorstep and then looked past her into the house and said, "I heard you know about remedies." Anya had not said anything about knowing remedies to anyone. She looked at Bess Larkin. "Where did you hear that?" "Dorothy Peters said you asked for certain herbs, said you knew what you were doing with them." A pause. "Dorothy Peters talks a great deal," Anya said. "She does," Bess agreed. "Usually about the wrong things. This time I'm hoping she got it right. My Tommy has had that cough for 10 days and I don't want to lose him to it." Anya stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. Tommy Larkin was 4 years old and small for his age, and the cough, when Bess described it, sounded to Anya like the kind that settled into the chest and decided it lived there. She knew this cough. She'd grown up with this cough in Poland, in a house where winter lasted 6 months, and the doctor was 2 villages away, and her mother had learned what to do because not learning meant not surviving. Anya had not thought of this knowledge as anything remarkable. It was simply what you knew when you were raised by women who had to know things. She sent Bess home with the cloth bundle of dried herbs and instructions for a steam treatment and a warning that if the cough got worse before it got better, she should tell Everett, and they would send for the actual doctor from Casper. She did not make promises she couldn't keep. She told Bess what she knew and where her knowledge ended. Bess Larkin looked at her on the doorstep, bundle in hand, with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite apology, but something suspended between the two. "I should have come sooner," she said. It was unclear whether she meant about Tommy's cough or about something else entirely. "Tommy should be better in a few days," Anya said. "Come back if he isn't." She closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She didn't feel anything particularly large. She felt tired in the specific way you feel tired when you've been bracing for something unpleasant, and it turned out to be ordinary. She went back to the kitchen and finished mending the curtain she'd been working on. And when Everett came home that evening, she told him about Bess Larkin, straightforwardly, because she'd decided early on that she wasn't going to manage information around him. She told him things when they were relevant. He had told her once that he was a man who valued accuracy over comfort, and she had believed him, and it was one of the reasons she was still here and not counting the days to spring. Everett listened to the whole thing. "How's the boy?" he said. "I think he'll be fine," she said. "I'm not a doctor." "No," he said. "But you knew what to do." "My mother knew what to do," she said. "I just retained it." He nodded slowly. "I'll stop by the Larkin place tomorrow," he said. "Check in." "You don't need to do that for me." He looked at her. "I'm not doing it for you," he said. "I'm doing it because I want to know if the kid is all right. Is that acceptable?" She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "That's acceptable." Tommy Larkin was better by Friday, and on Saturday, Bess Larkin came back to the door. Without Tommy, without a sick child, without any practical reason. And she came with a jar of put-up peaches from her own cellar, and she stood on the doorstep and said, "I wanted to bring this, just to say thank you." Anya accepted the peaches. She said, "That wasn't necessary." "No," Bess said. And the word had a different weight in it now, the weight of a woman who was saying something she'd been thinking about. "But I wanted to." She left. Anya stood in the doorway holding the jar and looking at the space Bess had occupied, and she felt something shift very slightly in the architecture of the situation. Subtle, like a timber settling, barely perceptible unless you were paying attention. She put the peaches on the shelf and didn't mention them to Everett until he noticed them himself 3 days later. "Where did those come from?" he said. "Bess Larkin," she said. He looked at the jar for a moment, then he said, "Good," and left it at that. She thought that was probably the right response. The third week of the storm brought its own specific cruelties, unrelated to gossip or politics or jars of peaches. The cold deepened. Not dramatically. It wasn't the kind of cold that surprised you, it was the kind that accumulated. The kind that wore things down over days until what had been manageable became genuinely difficult. The water pipe on the east side of the house froze and then cracked, and Everett spent an entire Saturday on his back in the crawl space under the house, doing something with copper fittings that resulted in blue knuckles and language that he apologized for, to no one in particular, afterward. Anya handed him tools through the access panel without being asked, because she'd figured out by the second hour which tools he needed and in what order, and this turned out to be more useful than anything else she could have offered. "You've done this before," he said from under the house. "I've handed someone tools before," she said. "In Poland, the pipes froze every winter. My father fixed them. I was the one who handed him things." A pause, and then the sound of a wrench turning. "What did your father do?" Everett said. She was quiet for a moment. It was not a painful question, or rather, it was the kind of question that had the shape of pain but had lost most of its sharpness. "He was a carpenter," she said. "He died when I was 17. The wrench stopped turning for a second. Then it resumed. "I'm sorry," Everett said. "It was a long time ago," she said, not dismissively, just accurately. "Doesn't make it smaller," he said. She sat with that for a moment. "No," she said, "it doesn't." They didn't talk again until the pipe was fixed and Everett had climbed back out from under the house and was standing in the kitchen warming his hands over the stove. And even then it wasn't about fathers or Poland or loss. It was about whether the repair would hold and where the valve was if they needed to shut the water off quickly, and those were the right things to talk about. She'd learned that about him. He acknowledged things and then he let you decide what to do with the acknowledgement. He didn't push through. He didn't require you to make the moment larger than it needed to be. She found that she was grateful for that in a way that was hard to articulate. She'd spent years around people, employers primarily, mostly women, mostly in Chicago, who seemed to operate on the assumption that silence was a wound to be treated, who asked how she was doing and then leaned forward with their entire bodies, waiting, as though her answer was going to be the interesting part of their afternoon. She'd learned to give them enough to satisfy without giving them anything real, and after a while that performance had become so habitual that she sometimes forgot what the real version felt like. With Everett, there was no performance. He asked direct questions and accepted direct answers and didn't seem to require anything more from her. And the odd effect of that was that she found herself occasionally and against her careful intentions, offering things she hadn't meant to offer. The afternoon after the pipe repair, while Everett was writing up a report at the kitchen table and she was making bread at the counter, she said without planning to, "In Chicago, when I left the last job, they told me I had taken something." He looked up from the report. He didn't say anything. "I hadn't," she said, "but the wife had lost a brooch, and she needed somewhere to put that, and I was convenient." She kept working the dough. "They didn't call the police. I was let go. But they told the other families on the street, and after that no one would hire me, so I had to leave the city entirely." She felt him watching her, but she didn't look up. "That's why the letter was so careful," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "That's why." A pause. She heard him put his pen down. "For what it's worth," he said, "I never thought there was anything wrong with your letter." "You didn't know me from the letter," she said. "No," he said. "But I know people who have something to hide and people who are just tired. Your letter was tired." She stopped working the dough. She stood at the counter with her hands still in it, not moving, for long enough that it probably looked strange. She was trying to identify what she was feeling, and what she was feeling turned out to be the very simple and almost embarrassing thing of being understood, which she had not expected and which hit harder than she would have predicted. She went back to working the dough. "The woman in Chicago," she said carefully, "had a husband who looked at me in a way that his wife didn't like. I never did anything to encourage it, but it didn't matter." Everett was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. "It usually doesn't." She put the bread in the pan. "I just wanted you to know," she said, "in case anyone in town hears a different version. Chicago is not so far that stories can't travel." "If they do," he said, "I'll deal with it." She turned and looked at him then, directly, the way she'd looked at him on the train platform, assessing, direct, looking for the thing under the thing. He met her eyes without moving. "You shouldn't have to deal with it," she said. "Maybe not," he said, "but I would." He held her gaze for one more second, then looked back at his report. That bread going to be ready before dark? It needs an hour, she said. I'll be here, he said. She turned back to the counter. She thought, this is a complicated man in a simple-looking life, and she had the uneasy feeling that she was only beginning to understand the ratio. So, what Everett did not tell her, what he had not told anyone, was that the situation with Mayor Holt was getting worse, not better. It had started with the comment outside the jailhouse. It had progressed to Holt stopping in at the saloon and making the particular kind of pointed observations that weren't threats, but functioned as threats. Observations about the importance of the marshal maintaining the community's trust, about how a man in a position of authority had to be mindful of the example he set, about how people in Harlan Ridge had certain expectations. Holt was a man who operated almost entirely in implications, which Everett had always found more dangerous than direct confrontation, because implications couldn't be answered directly without sounding defensive. The third conversation had happened on a Wednesday, in Holt's office at the town hall. Holt had called it a courtesy meeting. He had a letter on his desk, which he pushed across to Everett without explanation. Everett read it. It was a letter from a man in Chicago named Gerald Forsyth, addressed to the mayor of Harlan Ridge. It said, in formal and pompous language, that he understood a woman named Anya Novak, formerly employed in his household, had recently taken up residence in Harlan Ridge, and that he wanted to alert the community's leadership to certain concerns about her character and trustworthiness. It did not specify the concerns. It simply left that word, concerns, sitting there like a stone in a shoe. Everett read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it on Holt's desk. When did this arrive? He said. Last week, Holt said. Why are you telling me now? I was deciding what to do with it. Everett looked at Holt. And what did you decide? Holt leaned back in his chair. He had the particular look of a man who believed he was being helpful when what he was actually being was dangerous. I think you need to consider whether this woman is who she says she is, he said. That's all I'm saying, Everett. I'm not making accusations. I'm saying, look into it. Everett stood up. I'll look into it, he said. He left before Holt could say anything else. He rode home thinking not about the letter, but about Gerald Forsyth. The name Anya hadn't given him. The name attached to the husband who had looked at her in a way his wife didn't like. He thought about the precision of the timing, the fact that a letter like that didn't arrive by accident. Someone had gone to the trouble of finding out where Anya had gone and contacting the people in charge of the place she'd gone to, and the reason people did that kind of thing was almost never about actually protecting anyone. It was about punishing. It was about the particular malice of powerful people who couldn't accept that someone beneath them had simply left and moved on. He thought about telling her. He thought about it the whole way home, and by the time he got there, he had decided that he would, but not tonight. Not when she'd just told him about Chicago that afternoon, and the air in the house still had that quality of something recently uncovered. She deserved a night's rest before she had to carry something new. He came in and hung up his coat and sat down and ate bread and stew and said nothing about the letter, and he watched her across the table and felt the specific weight of information he was choosing to hold, which was not exactly comfortable but felt, in this particular moment, like the only decent thing. You're quiet tonight, she said. I'm always quiet, he said. You're a different kind of quiet, she said. You're thinking about something you don't want to say. He looked at her. She looked back at him with those eyes that missed nothing. I'll tell you tomorrow, he said. A pause. Something moved across her face. Not panic, not quite, but the particular alertness of someone whose experience has taught them that tomorrow often means bad news with a night's delay. Is it about me? She said. He held her gaze. He owed her honesty. Yes, he said, but it's manageable. I want you to sleep tonight, not spend the night worrying about something I'm going to handle. She was quiet for a very long moment. He watched her decide whether to trust him, and he could see the decision happening in real time, which was uncomfortable in the way that witnessing a private thing is always uncomfortable. All right, she said finally. He nodded. They finished eating. She washed the dishes and he dried them, which had become their habit without either of them deciding it was their habit. And the domesticity of it sat strangely alongside everything he was carrying, but not badly, just strangely. He told her about this letter the next morning over coffee, before he'd even put his coat on. He told her directly, without softening it, because she had asked him not to soften things, and he was trying to respect that even when it was harder. She held her cup in both hands and listened. Her face went through 3 distinct things while he talked. Something sharp and almost startled. then something cold and flat, then something harder to read, a kind of internal reckoning that he had the sense he was only seeing the surface of. When he finished, she said, "Gerald Forsyth. That's the name on the letter." "He is not a good man," she said. Not angrily, just factually, in the same tone you'd use to report the weather. "I gathered," Everett said. She looked down at her cup. "What are you going to do?" she said. "Write back to him," Everett said. "Inform him that his concerns have been investigated and found to have no merit, and that any further correspondence on this matter will be noted as harassment." She looked up. "You don't know that his concerns have no merit," she said carefully. "You only have my word." "Yes," he said. "I do." He said it without emphasis, the way you say a thing that doesn't require emphasis because it's simply what's true. She stared at him. He was aware of being stared at, and he didn't move. "Everett," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his first name in 3 weeks, the first time, and it landed differently than he expected, like a key in a lock he hadn't known was there. "You've known me for 3 weeks." "Yes," he said. "That's not very long." "No," he said. "It's not." He stood up and reached for his coat. "It's long enough." He put his coat on. He picked up his hat. He was almost at the door when she said behind him, very quietly, "What if you're wrong about me?" He stopped. He thought about it, not because he hadn't thought about it before, but because she deserved a real answer and not a convenient one. "Then I'd be wrong," he said. "But I'd rather be wrong about a person while trusting them than right about them while treating them like they're guilty before they've done a thing." He put his hat on. "I've been wrong about people before. It doesn't kill you." He went out. The door closed behind him. He stood on the porch for a second in the cold air, and he could hear very faintly the sound of her moving in the kitchen. He rode into town and wrote the letter to Gerald Forsyth, and he made it short and formal and final, and he did not consult Holt before he sent it. Holt found out about it anyway. Small town, small post office. Dorothy Peters was not the only person in Harland Ridge constitutionally incapable of keeping information to herself. He came to the jailhouse that afternoon with his round face red and his voice very controlled, which was the version of Aldrich Holt that Everett found most wearing, because controlled anger from a powerful man always had more range than the loud kind. "You had no right to respond to that letter without consulting me," Holt said. "It was addressed to you," Everett said. "I answered it on your behalf. Seemed efficient. That is not your call to make." "My call," Everett said, "is what happens in this town regarding law and order. Someone is attempting to damage the reputation of a private citizen in my community based on the complaint of a man who has no jurisdiction here and has made no specific accusation. That's my call, Aldrich." Holt's jaw was tight. "You're protecting her." "I'm doing my job," Everett said. "If you'd like to discuss the difference, I'm happy to have that conversation." A long pause. Holt looked at him with an expression that was several things at once: frustration, calculation, something that might have been respect and resented being. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," Everett said. "I'm not worried about it." Holt left. Everett locked the jailhouse and rode home, and did not examine too carefully why home was the word that came to him automatically now, without effort, without the small internal correction he'd made in the first week. He came in, and she had made something with the peaches from the jar Bess Larkin had left, some kind of warm compote with the last of the dried spices, and the house smelled extraordinary, and she looked up when he came in and said, "Well?" He hung up his coat. "Holt knows," he said. "Was he angry?" "Very controlled," Everett said, "which is worse." She set the pan down. "I'm sorry," she said. "This is because of me." "No," he said. "It's because of Holt and Forsyth, and about 15 years of this town being told by those two kinds of men what counts as respectable." He sat at the table. "I'm not sorry I sent the letter." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and got 2 bowls from the shelf and put compote in both of them and set one in front of him and sat across from him. They ate in silence for a while. Then she said, "My mother used to make something like this. In winter, when there was nothing fresh left, she'd make it, and we'd eat it at the table, and it felt like being taken care of." He looked at her. "That's why I made it," she said simply. "It felt like the right thing to do today." He looked down at the bowl. He thought about Margaret and the cellar full of put-up peaches and the house that had been quiet for 3 years. He thought about all the things you lose when you lose a person and how you don't even know which of them you're missing until something touches the shape of them. "Thank you," he said. He meant it for more than the compote, and she probably knew that, but neither of them acknowledged it, because some things are better received quietly. They sat there as the evening came down around the house, and the snow fell outside, and the fire did what fires do. And the silence between them was by now a different thing entirely from what it had been. Not empty, not cautious, but full of the particular texture of two people who have begun, carefully and against their own better judgment, to matter to each other. And neither of them knew what to do about that yet, but neither of them was running from it. That, for now, was enough. The letter to Gerald Forsyth went out on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, Harlan Ridge had already decided what it meant, not the letter itself. Most people never saw it, but the fact of it traveled, the way facts always traveled in small towns, which was to say imprecisely and with great enthusiasm. What people understood was that Mayor Holt had received a concerning letter about the foreign woman living at the marshal's house, and that instead of taking it seriously, Everett Kane had written back on her behalf without consulting anyone. That was the version that circulated. That was the version that settled into the grooves of the town's collective thinking and stayed there. Everett noticed the change the following week when he rode in for his Monday rounds. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing in Harlan Ridge was ever dramatic in the obvious sense. It was more like a change in atmospheric pressure. Men he knew well nodded and moved on instead of stopping to talk. Conversations near him at the feed store reached natural pauses that hadn't been natural a week ago. Even Carl Ridley, who ran the livery stable and had been Everett's most reliable source of uncensored town opinion for 8 years, was somehow busy every time Everett came by. He'd felt this before. He knew what it was. It was a town making up its mind, and the process of a town making up its mind was not pretty and not fast and not something you could interrupt by explaining yourself, because the moment you started explaining was the moment you'd already lost the argument. I didn't explain himself. He did his rounds, dealt with a fence dispute on the Carver property, checked in on a family who'd reported their eldest son missing, only to find the boy had gone to shelter with a neighboring family during the worst of the storm, and rode home in the early dark feeling the cold in his knees the way he always did now. A reminder that 51 was not 40, and that the body remembered things the mind preferred to set aside. Anya had the lamp on when he came in, which he'd stopped noticing as remarkable because it had become simply the way things were. She looked at him when he hung up his coat and she said without preamble, "What happened in town?" "Nothing specific," he said. She gave him a look that meant she didn't believe him, but was deciding whether to push. She decided not to, which was its own kind of gift. "I heard a wagon on the road today," she said. "It slowed down in front of the house. Then it kept going." He paused. "You sure it slowed?" "I was by the window," she said. "I'm sure." He thought about that. He hung up his gun belt and sat down and said, "I'll ask around tomorrow." "Probably nothing." "Probably," she said. And they both knew that probably was not the same as certainly, and that they were both choosing to let the distance between those two words go unexamined for now. Dinner was quiet that night. Not uncomfortably, just the kind of quiet that comes when two people are both thinking about the same thing and neither is ready to say it out loud. She'd made something with dried apples and cornmeal that shouldn't have worked as well as it did, and he ate 2 portions and said so, and she said the apple season had been good apparently because Dorothy Peters had given her more than the mushrooms. A whole paper sack of dried fruit last week when Everett had taken her to collect the mail. "Dorothy Peters keeps giving you things," Everett said. "She does," Anya said. "I think it's her way of apologizing without using the word." He looked at her. "For what?" "For whatever she said before I got here," Anya said simply. "I don't know exactly what it was, but I can always tell when someone's feeding me out of guilt." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's not a bad woman." "I know that," Anya said. "Bad people don't apologize, even indirectly." She pushed a piece of apple around her bowl. "It's the ones who are decent underneath the nonsense that are worth the patience." He thought about that for the rest of the evening and didn't say anything about it, but he held it. The petition arrived on a Friday. It was not called a petition. It was called a letter of community concern, which was what you called things in Harlan Ridge when you wanted them to sound reasonable. It was signed by 11 people, he counted, twice, because he didn't believe it the first time. 11 names. 3 of them were men he considered friends, or had considered friends. which was the part that landed hardest. The letter did not accuse Anya of anything specific. It expressed concern about the appropriateness of a single woman of foreign origin living alone with an unmarried man who held a position of public authority. It suggested that this arrangement reflected poorly on the values of the community. It asked, in language that was polite in the way that certain kinds of pressure are always polite, that Marshal Kane consider making alternative arrangements. Holt delivered it personally. He came to the jailhouse with it in a folder, which told Everett that Holt wanted this to feel official, wanted Everett to feel the weight of organized disapproval rather than just one powerful man's irritation. Everett read it at his desk while Holt stood near the window, looking out at the street, giving him what he probably thought was respectful space. 11 people, Everett said. There are more who feel this way, Holt said. These are just the ones willing to put their names on it. And the ones who aren't willing to put their names on it, Everett said. What does that tell you? Holt turned from the window. It tells me that there's real concern in this community and that some folks are too polite to make it formal. Or, Everett said, it tells you that some folks know this is wrong but don't want to be the one who says so. He put the letter down on his desk. How long did it take you to gather 11 signatures, Aldrich? A pause. That's not the point. It is the point, Everett said, because I've been marshal here for 11 years. I've kept this town safe through 2 hard winters, a fever outbreak, a cattle war that should have been 10 times worse than it was, and a deputy who turned out to be taking money from the Carver family. 11 years. And you brought me 11 signatures. Holt's face was doing the red thing. I'm trying to help you, he said. I know you believe that, Everett said. He said it without heat and without concession, which he found was more effective than either. But what you're actually doing is asking me to remove a person from my home because the people who signed this letter are uncomfortable with who she is and where she's from, and I'm not going to do that. You're throwing away your reputation, Holt said, over a housekeeper. Everett stood up. He was not a short man, and the desk between them was not large, and when he stood up, the room rearranged itself slightly. She's not a housekeeper, he said. She's a person. Her name is Anya Novak. She came here because she needed work, and she has done that work with more dignity than half this town has shown her, and I will not ask her to leave because 11 people have decided to be embarrassed about something that is none of their concern. Holt looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across the mayor's face. Not quite remorse, not quite backing down. More like a recalculation. You could at least make it look more proper, he said. Arrange for her to stay with one of the families in town. She could come out during the day. No, Everett said. Everett, no, Aldrich. He picked up the letter and held it out. Take this back. If the 11 people who signed it want to speak with me directly, I'll be available. If they don't, I consider this matter closed. Holt took the letter. He did not leave immediately. He stood there holding the folder and looking at Everett with an expression that had moved past frustration into something more complicated, something that might have been, if Everett was reading it correctly, genuine bafflement. What is she to you? He said. Honestly. The question sat in the room. Everett thought about it. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was trying to find the version of the answer that was true without being more than he'd admitted to himself. Someone who deserved better than what she got, he said, and is getting it now. That's what she is. Holt left. Everett stood at the window and watched him walk back toward the town hall, and he felt the complicated mixture of things a man feels when he's done the right thing and it has cost him something. Not regret, not exactly, but a kind of clarity about what the cost of being right sometimes looks like. He rode home and told her about the petition. He had considered, briefly, not telling her. He dismissed the idea almost immediately. She was not a child, and this was not his secret to keep. She listened. She was standing at the counter with her hands still, and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when he finished, she said very quietly, 11. Yes. Did you know all of them? Most? She turned to face him. Her expression was doing the controlled thing, the professional blankness, but it was working harder than usual. He could see the effort. What did you tell Holt? She said. He told her. She looked at him for a long time after he finished. Long enough that he became aware of the fire, and the sound of the wind, and the particular quality of the lamp in the late afternoon. Long enough that he started to wonder if he'd said the wrong thing somewhere, if he'd misjudged something, if the directness that she'd said she valued was suddenly too much. Then she said, You shouldn't have done that. He blinked. Why not? Because you'll lose things, she said. Her voice was steady, but it had something in it now, an undertow. Your reputation, your relationships with those people. You don't know what this will cost you, and you did it without— I did it, he said, because it was right. That's not enough, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, just slightly, and she stopped and pressed her lips together and looked at the floor. I have been the reason people lost things before, she said after a moment. In Chicago. I have been the reason someone's situation got worse just by being near them, and I will not be that here. I cannot be that. He crossed the kitchen and stood close enough that she had to look up. Anya, he said. Her name in his voice, the way she'd said his name that morning a week ago. A key in something. She looked up. Her eyes were dry, but barely. You are not a problem that happened to me, he said. You're a person in my house who has done nothing wrong. The problem is 11 people who need something to be afraid of. He held her gaze. I'm not going to let them use you for that. I was going to do this regardless of what it cost me, and I want you to stop carrying their choice as though it's your fault. She was quiet for so long that he thought she was going to say something large, something that would change the shape of the evening. But what she said was, I don't know how to do that. I know, he said, but you can start. She looked at him for one more moment, and then she nodded very slightly and turned back to the counter, and he stepped back and the kitchen rearranged itself around the two of them the way rooms do when something has shifted inside them. He sat at the table. She started cooking. He watched the fire. He thought, there is something happening here that I am going to have to examine eventually. He thought, not tonight. The following week was the hardest the winter had produced, not because of the petition that had subsided into a sullen quiet, the way organized disapproval often did when the target simply refused to respond to it. But the cold deepened past anything Harlan Ridge had seen in 6 years, and cold of that degree had a way of making everything else secondary. 3 families on the eastern edge of the territory lost livestock. A widow named Muriel Strand, who was 73 and lived alone 2 miles north of the main road, ran out of firewood and was found by her neighbor half frozen and was brought into town in a wagon. Everett spent 4 consecutive days riding out to properties, checking on people, mediating the kind of death that happened when cold and fear and confinement pushed people past their patience. He came home after dark every one of those 4 days, sometimes close to midnight, and every night Anya had something hot on the stove and a lamp in the window, and she never said a word about the hour. On the 3rd night he came in and she took one look at him and said, "Sit down and take your boots off. Your feet are wet." He sat down. He took his boots off. They were wet. He had no idea when that had happened. She brought him a basin of warm water and set it in front of the chair, which was something his mother had done when he was a child and which he had not thought about in decades. And the shock of the memory came at him sideways while he sat there with his feet in the water and his hands around a cup of coffee she'd also just appeared with. "Muriel Strand?" she said. She'd heard, because Bess Larkin had come by that morning. "She's at the Donovans," he said. "She'll be all right. She was lucky her neighbor checked." "Can she go home?" "Not until we get firewood out there and someone stays with her a few nights." He drank the coffee. "I'll arrange something tomorrow." Anya sat across from him. She said, "I could go?" He looked at her. "It's 2 miles north in this." "I know where it is," she said. "You told me, and I'm not afraid of cold." "There's cold and there's this particular cold," he said. "Everett." She said it with a patience that was somehow not condescending. "I have been inside this house for almost 5 weeks. I am capable of more than this house requires of me right now. Let me be useful." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about what it cost a person to say, "Let me be useful," not as a complaint, but as a genuine offer, as the statement of someone who had a larger capacity than their current circumstances were drawing on. "I'll take you out there day after tomorrow," he said, "when I've arranged the firewood. You can spend a few nights if you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. "You'll need to meet Muriel first," he said. She doesn't take to people fast." "I'm not fast," Anya said. He almost smiled. "No," he said, "you're not." They sat there in the lamplight, his feet in the basin, the coffee warm in his hands, and outside the world was ferociously cold, and inside it was not, and he thought about how long it had been since this particular warmth had existed in this room. And he thought about all the ways it was dangerous to need things you hadn't needed for a long time. He thought about it, and he set it aside, and he finished his coffee. The trouble came from a direction he hadn't anticipated, which was always the way real trouble came. His deputy, a young man named Wallace Pruitt, who was 24, eager, and deeply concerned with what other people thought of him, had been quiet about the petition situation. Too quiet, Everett had thought, but he'd attributed it to Pruitt's youth and his desire to stay out of things that involved the people above him in the town's informal hierarchy. He'd given the boy the benefit of the doubt. The benefit of the doubt turned out to be undeserved. He found out on a Saturday morning, not from Pruitt, but from Bess Larkin, who came to the door visibly uncomfortable. In the way people are visibly uncomfortable when they're bringing information they'd rather not be the one to bring. Anya was out. She'd walked to the Carmichael place half a mile east to borrow a pattern Mrs. Carmichael had offered her, and Everett had the house to himself, which was now a less natural state than it had been 2 months ago, and he noticed the difference. Bess stood in the doorway and said, "I think you need to know something, and I'm telling you because my husband thinks I should mind my own business. But I think you've been fair to me, and I owe you fairness back." "Come in," he said. She came in but didn't take off her coat. She said, "Your deputy has been talking. At the saloon, at the feed store. He's been saying things about Miss Novak and about why she's really here." Everett felt something go quiet in him, the particular internal quiet that preceded concentrated attention. "What things?" Bess was not comfortable with this. She looked at the floor and then at him. "He's been saying she's working on you, that she's clever and she knows how to make a lonely man feel needed, and that you've let your judgment go because of it. He said—" She stopped. "Bess," he said quietly, "say it." She looked up. "He said she's been that kind of woman before in Chicago. He said that's why she had to leave." Everett stood very still. "He didn't say where he heard it," Bess said quickly. "But it's been going around. People are listening to him, Everett, because he's your deputy, and they think I've told him something," Everett said. "Yes." He looked at the wall for a moment. He thought about Pruitt, who he'd trained himself, who he'd given a job to when the boy was barely old enough to shave, who he'd covered for twice when the boy made mistakes that could have cost him the position. He thought about the source of the story, about Chicago, about the shape of what Pruitt was saying. And he thought about who else had known enough to construct that version. Holt. Holt had told Pruitt, or Pruitt had found the letter, which Holt had kept and had assembled the story from that. "Thank you, Bess," he said. He meant it, and she could hear that he meant it. And she nodded and left, and he stood in the kitchen alone for a long moment, staring at nothing. He was angry. Not the hot, volatile anger of a young man, but the deep, quiet, structural anger of a man who has built something carefully over years and watches someone else take a hand to it carelessly. He was angry at Pruitt, and he was angry at Holt, and he was angry at the particular social machinery that made it so easy for people to destroy a woman's reputation without ever being required to explain themselves. And underneath the anger was something more tender, the knowledge that Anya would hear about this, that she was going to walk back in through that door, and at some point today or tomorrow or the day after, she was going to find out what was being said about her in the saloon and the expression she'd had when she told him about Chicago, that carefully controlled, professionally blank expression, working hard, working harder than it should have to. That expression was going to happen again, and he couldn't stop it. He put his coat on and rode into town. He found Pruitt at the jailhouse, which was where Pruitt was supposed to be. The boy was at the desk doing paperwork, and he looked up when Everett came in and his face did something complicated. Surprise, then guilt, then a rapid attempt at neutral that came approximately 4 seconds too late. Everett closed the door. He said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want a straight answer." Pruitt said, "Sir, have you been talking about Miss Novak at the saloon?" A pause. The pause was long enough to be an answer, but Pruitt was young enough to still believe that pauses could be recovered from. "I've just been... People ask me questions, and I'm your deputy, and I don't always know what to say." "What did you tell them?" Everett said. Another pause, shorter this time. "I told them what I heard, that there were concerns about her character, that she'd had trouble in her last position." "Where did you hear that?" Pruitt looked at the desk. "Mayor Holt mentioned it." Of course he had. "Did Mayor Holt tell you to repeat it?" "He said people had a right to know." Everett looked at his deputy for a long time. Pruitt was not a bad young man. That was the complicated part. He was the kind of young man who wanted to please the people above him more than he wanted to know what was right, which was a common failing and not an irredeemable one. but it had consequences, and he needed to understand that. Wallace, Everett said, and using the boy's first name made him look up, because Everett didn't often use first names. What you repeated was a story told by a man in Chicago who had reasons of his own for telling it. You repeated it without knowing if it was true, and you repeated it because the mayor said to, and now it's going around town and it's going to reach her, if it hasn't already. Pruitt's face was miserable. I didn't think— No, Everett said. You didn't. He pulled a chair out from the opposite side of the desk and sat. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop. No more conversations about her to anyone, at the saloon or anywhere else. If someone asks you about her, you tell them you were mistaken and that you had no right to say what you said. Pruitt looked up, alarmed. They'll think I lied. You did lie, Everett said. You repeated something as though it were true when you had no way of knowing if it was. That's a kind of lying. He held the boy's gaze. I'm not going to fire you for it because I think you made a mistake and not a decision. But if it happens again, it becomes a decision, and then we'll have a different conversation. Pruitt nodded. He looked like he'd been deflated. I'm sorry, he said. Tell her that, Everett said. Not me. Pruitt looked startled. Tell Miss Novak? She's the one you owe it to, Everett said. He stood. I'll bring her into town in a few days. You'll have the chance. He left the jailhouse and went to Holt's office. Holt was there, which Everett had counted on. He was a man of rigid routine, Holt. He came to the office at 9, left at 12, came back at 2, left at 5. You could set a clock by him, which meant you could also plan around him, which Everett had always found useful. I went in without knocking, which he'd never done before, and Holt looked up from his desk with an expression that was immediately, visibly on guard. What did you tell my deputy about Anya Novak? Everett said. Holt set his pen down. He had the look of a man composing himself. I shared information that I felt was relevant. You told a 24-year-old boy who works for me a story designed to damage a woman's reputation, knowing he would repeat it because you didn't get the result you wanted from the letter or the petition. Everett stood in front of the desk, and he was not raising his voice, which was worse. That is what you did, Aldrich. You want to tell me that isn't right, or are we going to continue to call it sharing information? Holt's jaw was tight. I am trying to protect this town. You're trying to get what you want, Everett said. That's not the same thing, and you know it. He put his hands on the desk. I want this to stop. I want it to stop today. Not because I'm asking you, because I'm telling you. If I hear one more thing, one more story, one more implication, one more letter from Chicago being shown around, I will start asking questions about this town's last election, and specifically about the arrangements with the Carver family that I've been looking the other way about for 2 years as a courtesy. Silence. Holt looked at him. Something moved across his face, shock, fury, and then, beneath both of those, the cold calculation of a man who was recalibrating. That's a threat, Holt said. It's an observation, Everett said. One I'm making now, clearly, so there's no confusion later about whether I said it. He straightened. We've known each other a long time. I'd like to keep it that way, but not at this price. He left. He rode home and she was there, back from the Carmichael place, sitting at the table with a piece of fabric and a pattern she'd borrowed. And she looked up when he came in, and something in his face told her immediately that the day had been worse than expected. What happened? She said. He sat down across from her. He told her about Pruitt. He told her exactly what was being said in the saloon, because she deserved to know the shape of the thing she was dealing with, not a softened version of it. He watched her face while he talked, and he watched the controlled blankness work. And he watched it slip, just for a moment, just enough to show the thing underneath. Not tears, nothing so simple, but a weariness so deep it looked almost like grief. It follows me, she said when he finished. It follows the story Forsyth told, he said. That's different. Is it? She looked at the fabric on the table. Her hands were flat on the surface. Everywhere I go, there's a version of this. A different city, different people, same story. She said it without self-pity. Just the flat factual tone of someone reporting on a pattern. I start thinking it might be different, and then, it will be different, he said. She looked up. You can't know that. I handled it today, he said. You can't handle everything. I'm not trying to handle everything, he said. I'm trying to handle the specific things in front of me, and today those were Pruitt and Holt. Tomorrow, it'll be whatever's tomorrow. He paused. I'm not saying nothing will go wrong. I'm saying I'm not going to stop. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them, and in its light he could see the specific quality of someone deciding how much to believe. Not about the facts, but about the person saying them. Deciding whether the word of a stubborn Wyoming marshal was worth the risk of trusting it. "Why?" she said, quietly, not combatively. With the genuine uncertainty of someone who did not understand the reason for something that looked, from where she was standing, like an irrational amount of effort. He thought about the answer. He'd been thinking about the answer for a while now, actually, working around it the way you work around a thing you're not ready to name directly. "Because you deserved better from the beginning," he said. "And I have the ability to give you better, and not doing that, that's not something I'm willing to live with." She was still. The house was still. Outside, the wind was, briefly, also still, and the silence was complete and weighted. Then she looked back down at the fabric. She picked it up. Her hands were not entirely steady. "All right," she said. "Just all right." The same word she'd said weeks ago when he'd told her about the Forsyth letter. But it meant something different now, or maybe it meant the same thing with more layers, more trust, and more exposure, and more of the fragile, inconvenient truth that they were both now carrying, which was that what had begun as a practical arrangement had become something neither of them had a clean word for, and neither of them was going to say out loud. Not yet. He got up and made coffee. She kept working on the pattern. He brought her a cup without asking if she wanted one, and she took it without commenting, and they sat there in the particular domestic quiet of two people who are past the stage of performing and into the strange territory of simply being, and neither of them spoke again for a long time. It was enough. More than enough. It was in fact the most that either of them had allowed themselves in longer than either could clearly remember, and the weight of it was neither light nor crushing. It was exactly as heavy as it needed to be. 3 days later, he took her to meet Muriel Strand. Muriel was staying temporarily at the Donovans, and she received Anya with the wariness of a woman who had been alive long enough to reserve judgment as a matter of principle. She was small and sharp-eyed and wrapped in a quilt even indoors, and she looked at Anya for approximately 45 seconds before she said, "You're the Polish girl everyone's talking about." "Yes," Anya said. "They're saying unflattering things," Muriel said. "I'm aware," Anya said. Muriel looked at her. "Are any of them true?" "No," Anya said. A pause. "You didn't hesitate," Muriel said. "I don't need to," Anya said. Muriel looked at Everett, then back at Anya. Then she said, "Can you make beet soup?" "Yes," Anya said. "My daughter used to make it," Muriel said. "I haven't had it since she died." She pulled the quilt tighter. "If you're coming to stay with me a few nights, I want beet soup." "I'll need beets," Anya said. "There are beets in my cellar," Muriel said. "There's still firewood left, even if it's low, and the supply he's bringing—" She jerked her chin at Everett. "Will be enough for the week." She looked at Anya again with the measuring look of a woman who had spent decades forming accurate opinions of people. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" Anya said. Muriel's mouth did something that was not quite a smile. "Someone more obvious," she said. Everett stood near the door watching this exchange, and he felt something that was so simple and so warm that it took him a moment to identify it, because it had been long enough that he'd half forgotten what it felt like. It felt like watching someone he cared about hold their own. It felt like pride and tenderness and relief all in one. He left her there with Muriel and drove back into Harland Ridge, and did not examine the particular quality of the silence that followed him all the way home. He'd been doing a lot of that lately, not examining things. He had the feeling, growing steadily stronger, that he was running out of time before he'd have to. Muriel Strand turned out to be the kind of woman who tested people the way cold weather tests old timber. Not to break them, but to find out where they were solid. She tested Anya on the first night with a request that was almost certainly designed to see what she'd do with inconvenience. She asked for the beet soup at 9 in the evening, well past any reasonable supper hour, with the specific casualness of someone who wanted to see whether the new person would accommodate the unreasonable or push back against it. Anya had made the soup. Not because she was a pushover. Everett, who heard the account later, understood immediately that it wasn't that, but because she'd assessed the situation and determined that Muriel wasn't being difficult, she was being scared, and scared people in their 70s who had almost frozen in their own homes 2 weeks ago deserved beet soup at whatever hour they asked for it. Muriel ate it in her quilt by the fire and said nothing about it, except that the seasoning was slightly different from her daughter's. What was different? Anya asked. She used more dill, Muriel said. I'll use more dill tomorrow, Anya said. Muriel looked at her over the bowl. You're not going to argue that yours is fine? It is fine, Anya said, but I'm not cooking it for me. A pause. Muriel went back to the soup. After a moment she said without looking up, My daughter died 4 years ago. Fever. I'm sorry, Anya said. Not elaborately, just cleanly. She was 31, Muriel said. You're what, 29? Yes. She would have liked you, Muriel said. She didn't like easy people. She finished the soup and handed back the bowl. The dill is in the third jar on the left shelf in the pantry. Anya took the bowl. I know, she said. I found it this afternoon. Muriel's mouth did the not quite smile. Go to sleep, she said. You can have the small room. The mattress is thin, but the quilt is good. Anya stayed 3 nights. When Everett came to bring her back, Muriel stood in the doorway of the Donovan house watching them from the porch. And when Anya turned to wave, she said, loud enough to carry in the cold air, You come back when they let me go home. I'll have you make that soup properly. Everett looked at Anya in the wagon. Anya was looking at her hands. That's the warmest she gets, he said. I know, Anya said. It's warm enough. He drove them back through the cold, and the road was hard, and the wind was sideways, and neither of them talked much. But it was the kind of not talking that had warmth inside it, which was still something he was getting used to, the discovery that silence could have different temperatures. The shift in Harland Ridge happened the way most genuine shifts happen, which is to say slowly and without announcement and only recognizable in retrospect. It started with Pruitt. True to his word, and to his credit, Everett would admit later, the boy did have a functional conscience underneath the people-pleasing. Wallace Pruitt went to the saloon 3 days after their conversation and told the 3 men he'd been most vocal with that he'd been wrong about what he'd said, that he'd repeated things he shouldn't have repeated, and that Miss Novak had done nothing that deserved the treatment she'd been getting. He said it standing up, which several people noted, because saying you were wrong while sitting on a bar stool had a different quality than saying it on your feet. Nobody applauded. Nobody changed their minds on the spot. But the story stopped having a source, and stories without sources lose their structural integrity fairly quickly. The second thing was Muriel Strand, who was returned to her own home on a Wednesday with a fresh supply of firewood and a neighbor's agreement to check on her daily, and who told anyone who asked that the marshal's housekeeper had stayed with her 3 nights and made beet soup and had not once been condescending about the situation or falsely cheerful about the cold or any of the other things people did when they were helping you and wanted you to know they were helping you. Muriel said she was competent and straight-talking and had good instincts about what people actually needed versus what they said they needed. And Muriel Strand's opinion in Harland Ridge carried a particular weight that came from her advanced age and her absolute indifference to what anyone thought of her opinions. The third thing was the Henderson boy. Little Marcus Henderson, who had been sick when Everett brought the bread, had recovered. But in late January, his older sister Clara came down with the same thing, and Eleanor Henderson, who had been cautiously warming to Anya since the bread but hadn't fully committed to an opinion, came to the door herself this time. She didn't send her husband. She came on her own, in the cold, with her coat over a house dress because she'd left in a hurry, and she knocked on the door, and when Anya answered, she said, Clara's bad, worse than Marcus was. I don't know what to do, and the doctor's still snowed in out of Casper. Anya got her coat. She went to the Henderson house for 2 days. She managed the fever with cool cloths and the chest congestion with steam and the herbs she'd replenished with the supplies from Everett's weekly list. And on the second night, when Clara's fever finally broke and the little girl asked for water, and Eleanor Henderson sat in the chair beside the bed and put her face in her hands and made the particular sound of a mother whose fear is releasing, Anya quietly made tea in the kitchen and left it on the table and went to the small room to sleep for 4 hours. Clara Henderson recovered. Eleanor Henderson, who had not signed the petition but had also not spoken against it, told her husband that she didn't care what Aldrich Holt or Gerald Forsyth or anyone else said, and she told him this in the specific tone of a woman who has made up her mind and expects no argument, and Thomas Henderson, who was a sensible man, offered none. Everett heard about this from Bess Larkin, who heard it from Eleanor herself, and he filed it away without comment. He was building a picture. He did this with most things, assembled details patiently, gave them time to develop, waited before drawing conclusions. It was partly temperament and partly 11 years of marshalling, which had taught him that the picture was almost never complete when you thought it was. He told Anya about Clara Henderson when she got back. She said, "She'll be fine. The fever had already turned when I left." "Eleanor Henderson is grateful," he said. "I know," Anya said. She was taking off her coat, and she was tired. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, that particular fatigue that comes from 2 days of sustained vigilance. "She brought me tea this morning, stood in the doorway and said thank you, and I could tell it cost her something to say." "It would have," he said. "I don't need her to feel guilty," Anya said. She hung up her coat. I just want them to see me, not who they decided I was before they met me." He looked at her. She was standing by the door, her hair coming loose from its pin, her dress wrinkled from 2 days in someone else's house. And she looked, in that moment, more genuinely herself than he'd ever seen her. Not composed, not professionally careful, just a tired woman saying what she actually meant. "They're starting to," he said. She looked at him. "Is it enough?" "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but it's more than it was." She nodded. She went to the kitchen and he heard her put the kettle on, and he sat at the table and thought about what enough would actually look like. And he found that the shape of it in his mind was not what he would have predicted 2 months ago when he'd driven a wagon to a train platform in the first storm of the season. February came in hard. The kind of hard that even people who had lived in Wyoming their whole lives described as serious. 3 days of temperatures that made the outdoor work not just unpleasant, but dangerous. Where exposed skin told you it was time to go inside within minutes. Where the livestock needed tending twice as often, and the wood supply consumed itself at a rate that felt almost punitive. Everett was out every day. Not because he chose to be, but because February did not ask for preferences. There were disputes over shared resources that became acute under pressure. Who had the right to draw water from a shared well when the other well was frozen? Who was responsible for the fence line when the snow had buried the markers? Small things that became large things when people were cold and tired and running out of patience. He handled them the way he always did. Not with force, not usually, but with the particular authority of a man who was present consistently enough that people knew he would be there and knew what he expected. He'd learned, over the years, that most of what people needed in a crisis was not solutions. It was someone who appeared to know what they were doing, who took their problems seriously, and who didn't leave before the thing was actually resolved. He came home on the 4th day of the worst stretch to find 3 people in his kitchen. This was not what he expected. He stood in the doorway in his coat with the cold still on him and looked at Anya at the stove and Bess Larkin at the table with her youngest on her lap, and a man he recognized as Frank Calloway, one of the homesteaders from a mile east, standing near the back window with his hat in his hands. "What happened?" Everett said. Anya turned from the stove. Her expression was calm in the way it was always calm, but there was something alert in it. "The Calloway's stove went out," she said. "The flue cracked. They've been without heat since this morning." Everett looked at Frank Calloway. Frank was 45, a quiet man who had homesteaded alone for 2 years and married a woman from Nebraska named Ruth 5 years ago, and he had the look of someone who was not accustomed to asking for help and was finding it difficult. "My wife's inside," Frank said. "I didn't want to move her. She's in the family way." Everett calculated. A pregnant woman in an unheated house in February. "How far along?" 7 months, Frank said. "She needs to be somewhere warm," Everett said. He looked at Anya. She was already looking at him. "She can stay here," Anya said. Not asking, stating. "There's the back bedroom." Everett thought about the back bedroom, which he hadn't opened in 3 years. "It hasn't been heated," he said. "I'll heat it," she said. "It'll take a few hours. She can be comfortable by tonight." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the fact that she had offered his house. Their house, he thought, and then caught himself on that word. Without hesitation, without calculating whether this was hers to offer. It probably wasn't, technically, but she'd offered it the way a person offers something that they are genuinely willing to give, and that was a different thing. "Go get Ruth," he said to Frank. Frank Calloway put his hat on and went. Anya was already moving. She'd turned back to the stove, and she said to Bess, still at the table with the youngest, "Can you help me with the bedroom? I need to get the small stove in there running, and I need an extra set of hands." Bess, who'd apparently arrived with the Calloway situation and stayed, said, "Of course," and handed the baby to Everett, who received it with the slightly alarmed expression of a man who has not held an infant in quite some time and finds it a more precarious experience than he remembered. The baby looked at him. He looked at the baby. "Just sit," Anya said, not looking at him. "She's fine." He sat. The baby grabbed his finger with the particular grip of someone who has no idea how strong they are, and he looked at the small fist around his finger and felt something happen in his chest that he hadn't expected and didn't examine. Ruth Calloway arrived an hour later, large with the pregnancy and pale from cold and trying very hard to hold herself together in front of people she didn't know well. Anya met her at the door and took her coat and said, "The room's warm. Come in and sit. I've got soup." Ruth looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been managing fear for several hours and has just been offered a reason to let some of it go. "Thank you," she said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "It's nothing," Anya said, and she said it in the exact tone that made clear it was not nothing but that she was not going to require Ruth to be grateful about it. That evening, Everett's house had 5 people in it. Him and Anya and Ruth Calloway and Frank, who came back with supplies. Once his wife was settled and ended up staying for dinner because Anya had made enough food for twice that number, which Everett had started to understand was a habit of hers. Cooking for more than was needed, for the people who might show up, for the possibility of need. And Bess Larkin had sent her husband to collect her eventually, but had stayed through dinner because the youngest was asleep in the rocking chair in the corner and moving her seemed wrong. Dinner was loud in a way the house had not been loud in a long time. Frank Calloway, given warmth and food and a wife who was comfortable, turned out to have opinions about everything and the confidence to state them, and Bess Larkin was not a woman who struggled to fill conversational space. Everett sat at the head of the table and said perhaps 30 words through the whole meal and watched Anya manage the food and the conversation and the baby waking up halfway through and needing to be settled and Ruth needing more tea and Frank knocking over his water glass and all of it, with the same quiet competence that she brought to everything. And he thought, this is what she is when she's not being careful. He liked it. He liked it unreservedly, and he was done pretending he didn't. Later, after Frank and Ruth were settled in the back room and Bess had bundled up her youngest and gone home to her husband, Everett helped Anya wash the dishes in the particular silence of a shared task at the end of a long day. "You gave away the back bedroom," he said after a while. "You said I could," she said. "I did," he said. He stopped. He didn't know how to finish the sentence without opening something that wasn't ready to be opened. She looked at him sideways while she dried a bowl. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "You handled tonight well." She was quiet for a moment. "It needed handling," she said. "That's all." "Bess stayed," he said. "She didn't have to." "No," Anya said, "but she wanted to." She set the bowl on the shelf. "People want to help. Most people. They just need to know there's a place to do it." I thought about that. He thought about the house full of people, and the sound of voices, and the baby in the chair, and Frank Calloway's opinions, and Bess Larkin's certainty, and Ruth's careful gratitude. He thought about 3 years of silence in these rooms, and what the silence had been protecting, and whether the protection had ever been worth what it cost. Margaret would have done the same thing, he said. He said it carefully, because it was true, and because it was fair, and because he'd been thinking about it since dinner. "She would have had people in here before I'd finished taking my coat off." Anya set down the cloth she was holding. She turned to look at him. "She sounds like she was a good woman," she said. "She was," he said. She was exhausting sometimes, in the best way. She believed the house was for people, and I believed it was for resting, and we argued about it. He almost smiled. She won most of the time. "She was right," Anya said. "I know," he said. "I know that now better than I did then." She looked at him for a moment, and the kitchen was very quiet, and he was aware of standing close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her face and the something else underneath it, the thing that had been there for weeks now, the thing neither of them was naming. "You miss her," Anya said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. "Every day. Less sharply than I did." He looked at the stack of clean dishes. "She died in spring, 3 years ago. It was fast. A growth they didn't find in time." He paused. "The house was already full when she was here, and then it was empty, and I just let it stay empty because I didn't know what else to do with it." Anya was quiet. She didn't say she was sorry. She'd already said it once, months ago, in a different context, and she seemed to understand that saying it again would be a lesser thing than just listening. "I'm glad it's not empty anymore," he said. He said it to the dishes. Then he looked up at her. "I want you to know that. Whatever the spring brings, or whatever comes before, I want you to know that." She held his gaze. "I know," she said very quietly. "Do you?" he said. A pause. A real one. The kind that has weight. "I'm starting to," she said. It wasn't everything, but it was a step past the careful distance they'd been maintaining, and both of them knew it, and neither of them moved to take it back. I went to bed. She went to the room she'd been using, her room now in all the ways that mattered. And the house was full and warm and quiet in the right way. And outside February continued its work, and he lay in the dark and thought about things he was ready to examine now, finally, and he let himself examine them. The Callaway stove was fixed by a tinsmith brought down from Casper on the 4th day, and Frank and Ruth went back to their home with enough supplies to last the rest of the month, and a standing invitation from Anya that Ruth could come whenever she felt uncertain, which Ruth took seriously enough to show up twice in the next 2 weeks for no particular reason other than that Anya had meant it and Ruth had believed her. Frank Callaway, at the feed store the following week, said something to 3 men that traveled around Harland Ridge with a speed that suggested people had been waiting for someone to say it. He said that Everett Kane's housekeeper was more used to this town in a hard winter than half the people who'd been talking about her, and that he'd been in that house and he'd seen how things were, and whatever people were saying, what he'd seen was a woman keeping a household and caring for a sick neighbor and feeding strangers and asking for nothing in return, and he didn't understand what the problem was supposed to be. Nobody argued with Frank Callaway directly. Frank was not the arguing type, which paradoxically made him harder to argue with. Aldrich Holt heard about what Frank had said. He did not respond to it publicly, which was its own response. Holt was a man who understood momentum, and he could feel the momentum shifting, and a man who understood momentum also understood when to stop pushing against it and let it run its course. He still didn't like the situation. He still believed he was right about it, in the way that certain people always believe they are right about things, regardless of what the evidence does. But he had enough political instinct to recognize that publicly fighting a woman who had kept a pregnant neighbor warm in February and nursed 2 sick children was not a fight he could win. He said nothing. The silence cost him, but he paid it. What Everett noticed over the course of that February was not a dramatic reversal. Nothing in Harland Ridge was ever dramatic in the obvious sense. It was smaller than that. It was Carl Ridley at the livery stable being available again, and it was some men stopping to talk on his rounds again, and it was Dorothy Peters coming to the house on a Thursday with a bolt of blue fabric that she said she had more of than she needed, and had thought of Anya, which was an act of giving so pointed that everyone understood what it was actually about. Anya accepted the fabric without ceremony. She thanked Dorothy, who nodded and left quickly, the way people leave quickly when they've done something that matters and don't want to have to discuss it. "Blue," Everett said, and Anya brought it inside. "It's good quality," she said, running her hand over it. "She could have kept it." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "That's not nothing, is it?" "No," he said. "It's not nothing." She folded the fabric carefully and set it on the shelf, and there was something in the way she did it, the care of it, the deliberateness, that told him she understood the weight of what it represented. Not triumph. She wasn't built for triumph, just the quiet acknowledgement of a door that had been closed and was now, incrementally, opening. The thing that broke the last of the formal resistance came from a direction none of them expected, and it came on a Thursday at the end of February, and it came in the form of a telegram. Everett was at the jailhouse when it arrived, brought by the telegraph operator's boy, a 12-year-old named Pete, who ran messages around town for a nickel a delivery, and who arrived slightly breathless and waited while Everett read it. The telegram was from a law office in Chicago. It stated in the terse language of legal correspondence that a Gerald Forsythe had filed a formal complaint against one Anya Novak with the Cook County Clerk's office, alleging theft. The complaint had been investigated. The investigation had found the allegation to be without merit. The case had been formally closed. The law office was informing Marshal Kane of this because his office had been noted in the original complaint as the authority in the jurisdiction of current residents. Everett read it twice. He paid Pete his nickel. He sat at his desk for a moment with the telegram in his hand. He thought about the timing, whether it was coincidence or whether his letter to Forsyth had set something in motion, whether the formal response he'd made had prompted someone in Chicago to actually look at the situation rather than simply accept Forsyth's version of it. He'd never know. It didn't much matter. What mattered was that it was documented, formal, on paper, from a law office, cleared. He rode home. He didn't stop at Holt's office, which he could have done, which part of him wanted to do. He decided against it, not because he wanted to protect Holt from discomfort. He didn't, particularly, but because the telegram was not for Holt. It was not for any of the 11 people who had signed the petition, or the people in the saloon, or Dorothy Peters, or any of them. It was for Anya. She was at the table when he came in, working on the blue fabric from Dorothy Peters, cutting a careful line with scissors that she held with the precise attention of someone who had learned not to waste material. She looked up when he came in. He crossed to the table and set the telegram down in front of her without saying anything. She looked at it. She read it. He watched her face. She read it twice, the same way he had. And then she set it on the table, and she put her hands flat on either side of it, and she looked at it for a long moment. "It's over," he said. Not a question. "It's over," she said. Her voice was very level. "I'll have copies made," he said. "One for the town records, one for you to keep." She looked up at him. Something in her face was doing something he hadn't seen before, not the controlled blankness and not the professional composure, but something that was coming from deeper than those, something unguarded in a way she rarely allowed. "Everett," she said. "You don't need to say anything," he said. "I want to," she said. She stopped. She looked at the telegram again, then back at him. "I came here in November because I had nowhere else to go, and a man I'd never met sent me train fare because I answered an advertisement. I had $30 and one bag and a story I knew no one was going to want to hear." She paused. "I didn't come here expecting anything except work. I didn't come here expecting to be... I didn't expect any of this." He sat down across from her. "What did you expect?" "To survive the winter," she said, "and then decide what came next." He looked at the telegram between them on the table. "And now?" She was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable, and then she said, "Now I don't know what I expected to happen and what just happened." He understood that perfectly. He could have said the same thing. "The town is coming around," he said, slowly. "I know," she said. "It won't be fast," he said, "and some of them won't. That's just how it is." "I know that too," she said. "Does it bother you?" he said. She thought about it. Not briefly. Actually thought about it, which was something he'd always appreciated about her. The willingness to actually sit with a question before answering. "Less than it did," she said. "It used to feel like the whole room was against me. Now it feels like some of the room, which is different." She folded her hands on the table. "I used to think being accepted was what I needed. I'm not sure that's what I actually need anymore." He looked at her. "What do you need?" She met his eyes. "To know that where I am is where I'm supposed to be," she said. "To not be waiting for the moment it ends." He held her gaze. "It's not going to end," he said. She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He didn't move and he didn't qualify it and he didn't look away because he'd said what he meant and he didn't intend to apologize for it. "You don't know that," she said quietly. "I know it well enough," he said. The kitchen was still. The telegram was between them on the table. The blue fabric was folded at the edge. The scissors were where she'd left them when he'd walked in. The fire was going. The lamp was going. Outside, the last of February was making its final statement in the form of wind against the north wall. She picked up the scissors. She went back to the fabric. He watched her work for a moment. The line she cut was straight and certain, and her hands had steadied completely, and he thought about what it took for a person to become that steady and what that steadiness cost them, and he thought about the fact that she was still here, still in this chair, still cutting this line, and that was its own kind of answer. "I need thread to match this," she said, "when you go into town." "I'll get it," he said. "Blue," she said, "close to this shade. Dorothy will probably know." "I'll ask her," he said. She nodded. The scissors kept moving. He got up and put the kettle on because it was that time of day and because it was what you did when the important thing had been said and the room needed to come back to itself gradually, and some things were better honored in the ordinary than in the extraordinary. The kettle went on. The fabric got cut. The fire kept going. And outside, somewhere at the edge of things, February was finally, reluctantly, beginning to give. March came in the way. March always comes to Wyoming. Not gently, not with any of the soft suggestions of spring that people in warmer places associate with the month, but grudgingly, like something that has been holding on too long, finally beginning, against its will, to let go. The temperature climbed 4 degrees and then dropped 8. The snow that had crusted over the fields thawed along the edges and refroze by evening into something treacherous. The days got longer by minutes, not hours, and those minutes felt earned in the specific way that small things feel earned when you've spent 4 months in a place where nothing was easy. Everett noticed the light first. He'd always been that way, more attuned to light than to temperature, more responsive to the angle of things than to their quantity. The morning light in early March hit the kitchen window differently than it had in January, came in at a lower angle, lasted longer on the floor before the shadow of the eave cut it off. He noticed this on a Tuesday and said nothing about it, because it was not the kind of thing he generally said out loud. But he noticed it, and it settled in him like a small warmth. Anya noticed the mud. She mentioned it practically, without sentiment, the way she mentioned most things. The path from the back door to the woodpile was getting soft, and if it kept warming, they'd need to put something down before it became genuinely problematic. She'd found a stack of old boards in the back of the barn that would serve. She'd asked if he minded. He'd said no. She'd laid the boards herself, with a precision that suggested she'd done this kind of thing before, or at least had thought it through carefully before starting, and the path was dry and functional, and she didn't mention it again. These were the kinds of things that constituted the daily reality of their life together by March. And he was aware, in a way he hadn't been in November, of how much he'd come to rely on her particular way of seeing what needed doing, and doing it without requiring discussion. It was not that she was invisible, she was the opposite of invisible. She was in fact one of the most present people he had ever lived alongside. But she had a quality of efficiency that left space rather than consuming it, and that space had become, over the course of the winter, something he moved through differently than he'd moved through the empty space that had preceded her. I was thinking about this on a Thursday morning when she came in from checking on the garden beds. She'd started turning the soil in the ones along the south wall, testing what the cold had done to them. And she stood in the doorway and said, "The soil is good on the south side. Whatever your wife put in it held." He looked up from the table where he'd been writing a report. "She composted," he said, "every fall. I told her it wasn't necessary, and she did it anyway." "She was right," Anya said. She came in and took off her gloves. "I'd like to plant there in April if you're agreeable." He looked at her. She was asking permission, which she did less often now than she had in November, but she still did it for the things that felt like they crossed a line she'd drawn for herself about what was hers and what wasn't. The garden, apparently, was on that line. "Plant whatever you want," he said. She looked at him steadily. "That's a broad permission. I trust your judgment," he said. A pause. "Everett," she said, "April is spring." He held her gaze. He understood what she was actually saying. They'd agreed in November on a winter arrangement. Winter was ending. The thing that had been unspoken for months was now standing in the kitchen doorway between them, wearing her coat and holding her gloves. And it was time. "I know," he said. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said carefully. Not plaintively. That was not her register, just honestly. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying this because I'm afraid of having nowhere to go. I'm saying it because you should know the full situation before you say whatever you're going to say." He put his pen down. "What do you think I'm going to say?" She looked at the gloves in her hands. "I don't know," she said. "That's why I'm standing here telling you things first." He stood up. He crossed to where she was standing, not quickly, not with any of the dramatics the moment might have seemed to call for. He stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly. She did. "I was going to ask you to stay," he said. "Not until spring, permanently." The kitchen was very still. "As your housekeeper," she said. "No," he said. "Not as my housekeeper." She looked at him for a long time. He could see the thing happening in her face that happened when she was processing something significant. The careful, layered assessment, checking it from multiple angles, looking for the place where it didn't hold up. He let her look. He wasn't going anywhere. "I'm not an easy person," she said. "I know that," he said. "I have a past that is going to follow me," she said. "Gerald Forsyth is not the kind of man who stops because he's been told to stop. There will be other letters, other stories. The telegram closed one thing, but it didn't. I know, he said. And this town is coming around, he said. Not all of it. Some of it never will. I've made my peace with that. Have you? She said. And the question was genuine, not challenging. She actually wanted to know because she'd seen what the winter had cost him, and she wasn't willing to pretend it hadn't. He thought about it. He thought about Holt and the petition, and the 11 signatures, and Pruitt's miserable face, and the conversations that had stopped when he walked into rooms and the ones that had started again. He thought about what it had cost and what it had given back. Yes, he said. The people worth keeping are staying. She was still. Her hands tightened slightly on the gloves. You've been alone for 3 years, she said. Yes. And I've been alone for longer than that, in the ways that count. She said it carefully, not as an argument, but as a fact she needed him to hold the weight of. I don't know how to be with someone without waiting for it to end. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to fix that right away. I'm asking you to stop being ready to leave. Something moved across her face, something that was, if he was reading it right, and he thought he was, he'd been reading her face for 4 months, and he wasn't bad at it anymore. Something that was almost relief. The kind of relief that comes when a door you've been bracing against stops pushing back. That's a different thing, she said. Yes, he said. You want me to stay, she said. Not as your housekeeper. Not as, I want you to stay because this house is better with you in it, and I am better with you in it, and I am 51 years old. And I've been alone long enough to know the difference between loneliness that you manage and loneliness that you shouldn't have to. He said it without breaking it up, without the careful pauses he usually put around important things, because he wanted it said whole. And because you are exactly who you are, and I haven't known anyone who is exactly who they are in a long time. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said very quietly, I'm going to need you to not regret this. I won't, he said. You can't know. Anya. Her name, the way he said it now, which was differently than he'd said it in December, which had the weight of a winter in it. I know. She looked down at the gloves. She turned them over in her hands once. Then she looked up at him and said, all right, just all right. Again, the same word. But by now they both understood that her all right was not a small word. Her all right was the word she used when she had made up her mind at the deepest level available to her, when she had examined the thing from all angles and found that she was going to commit to it. It was a word that cost her something to say, because she did not give it lightly, and he knew that, and that was why he felt it the way he did, like something settling into the right place after a long time in transit. He put his hand out, she looked at it, and then she put her hand in his, and they stood there in the kitchen doorway, in the March morning light, with the mud outside, and the garden beds turned and ready, and the boards on the path, and everything around them ordinary and imperfect and exactly sufficient. He squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. Then she said, I still want to plant the south beds in April. I know, he said, and I want to fix the porch railing before the wood gets soft again. I was going to do that this weekend, he said. I know you were going to do it, she said. I want to help. He looked at her. There was something in her face that hadn't been there in November. Not happiness exactly, or not only that, but a kind of settledness. The expression of someone who has stopped calculating the distance to the exit and is simply standing in the room. All right, he said. She almost laughed. She didn't quite. She was still who she was, and she didn't laugh easily, but the sound that came out of her was close enough that it changed the air in the kitchen. You learned that from me, she said. I learned things, he said. She let go of his hand and went to the stove to put the kettle on, which was what you did in their house, when something important had just happened, and the important thing needed to be allowed to settle. And he went back to the table in his report, and the kitchen was warm with the ordinary sounds of two people occupying the same space without performing anything for each other. That was the moment. Not the hand, not the words. That was the moment. The return to the ordinary, chosen, without apology. He told Muriel Strand first, not because he'd planned to. It wasn't a planned announcement, wasn't something they'd discussed making official in any formal sense. And in any case, there was no particular category for what they were to each other that the town had a ready ceremony for. But he went to check on Muriel the following week, as he did periodically, And she was back in her own house by then, with her firewood stocked and her neighbor checking in and her sharp eyes tracking everything. And she looked at him when he came in and said, before he'd even sat down, "Something's different." "Is it?" he said. "Don't be coy, Everett. You've been marshal of this town for 11 years and you still can't keep things off your face when you're not thinking about it." She poured him tea without asking. "She's staying." He sat down. Down. "Yes." Muriel looked at him. She had the face of someone who had been right about a lot of things over 73 years and was comfortable with that record. "Good," she said. "That's all?" he said. "What else would you like me to say?" She sat across from him. "She made beet soup with the right amount of dill. She talked to me like I was a person instead of an inconvenience. She didn't flinch when I told her about my daughter." A pause. "And she looked at you when you came to take her back that day, like you were something she hadn't expected to find in this part of the world." The old woman picked up her own cup. "So, good." He sat with that for a moment. "Muriel," he said, "how long were you married?" 44 years, she said. "Walter died in 81. "Do you miss him?" She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Every day," she said. "But that's not the same as wishing things were different now." She set the cup down. "You think missing Margaret is a reason not to do this?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "It isn't," Muriel said flatly. "Margaret is dead. You're not. And I say that with respect for her memory and none at all for the idea that the dead want the living to be emptier than they have to be." She pointed a finger at him. "She stocked that cellar every fall. You think she did that for herself?" He looked at his tea. "She did it for whoever was going to need it," Muriel said, "including you." She settled back in her chair. "Now stop being mournful about being lucky and go fix whatever that girl has been asking you to fix on that house since November." He drank the tea. He said goodbye. He went home and fixed the porch railing with Anya holding the post while he worked the nails, and her hands were cold through her gloves by the time they were done, but neither of them mentioned stopping, and when it was finished, she tested it with her weight and said it was solid. And he said he'd paint it in April when the wood was dry enough, and she said what color. And they stood on the porch in the late winter light, arguing mildly about paint colors for 5 minutes, which was one of the more ordinary and excellent things that had happened in that house in years. Wallace Pruitt came to the house on a Saturday morning. He came on foot, which meant he'd walked from town, which was 1.5 miles, and which told Everett that the boy had wanted the time to prepare what he was going to say. Anya answered the door. Pruitt stood on the newly solid porch with his hat in his hands and his face doing several things at once, and he said, "Miss Novak, I came to apologize." She looked at him. She did not make it easy for him, but she didn't make it hard either. She just looked at him with those direct, assessing eyes and waited. "I said things about you," Pruitt said, "in the saloon and at the feed store. Things I shouldn't have said, things I didn't know were true, and I said them because Mayor Holt told me to and because I wasn't thinking about what it would do. I was thinking about what people above me wanted to hear." He stopped. He was clearly not finished, but had reached a point where the words were harder. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not just that it caused problems. I'm sorry that I did it. There's a difference." Anya was quiet for a moment. Everett was standing behind her, visible but not in the conversation, and he watched her face while Pruitt said his piece. "There is a difference," she said. "Yes." "I know one apology doesn't fix it," Pruitt said. "I know that. I'm not asking you to—" "Come in," she said. Pruitt looked surprised. "Ma'am?" "You walked 1.5 miles," she said. "Come in and have coffee." Pruitt looked past her at Everett, who gave him nothing useful. He came in. They sat at the table, the three of them, and Anya made coffee and didn't make it uncomfortable, which Everett thought was more generous than was required and completely in character. She asked Pruitt how long he'd been in Harland Ridge. It turned out 3 years, that he'd come from Nebraska after his father's farm failed. And she asked what he'd done before, and he talked with the loosening quality of someone who has been prepared for a hard conversation and found it unexpectedly survivable. When he was leaving, he said, in the doorway, "I've been thinking about what you did. In the winter, Mrs. Calloway and the Henderson children and Muriel Strand." He held his hat. "I think I told myself that the things I was saying about you were just information, just what I'd heard. But the way I said them wasn't information. It was a verdict." He looked at her. "I'm sorry for that specifically." She looked at him. "You were 24 years old," she said. And someone with authority told you what to think. That's not an excuse, but it's a reason. She paused. Don't do it again. No, ma'am, he said. He left. Everett stood at the window and watched him go. And he thought about what it cost a young man to do what Pruitt had just done, and he thought that maybe the boy was going to be all right. He meant it, Anya said beside him. Yes, Everett said. He did. I know, she said. I'm not a person who forgives easily, but I know when someone means it. He looked at her. Are you all right? She thought about it. Yes, she said. I think I am. She said it with the specific quality of someone testing the statement while they make it and finding that it holds. Yes, I am. April arrived with the particular gentleness that Wyoming sometimes, rarely, offered after a hard winter, as though the land itself understood that it owed people something after what February had done. The snow came off the fields in long days of moderate warmth, not dramatic, not flooding, just steady. The mud season was real, and it was difficult, but it was also evidence of something releasing. Anya planted the south beds on a Saturday. She'd made a plan, written it on a piece of paper, consulted with Dorothy Peters about what grew well in this soil, and Dorothy Peters had been so thoroughly helpful that Anya had come home with not only information, but also a paper twist of seed packets that Dorothy had pressed on her with the specific urgency of someone who needed to demonstrate commitment through practical action. Everett came out at midday and found her on her knees in the soil with her sleeves rolled in dirt on her forearms. And he stood at the edge of the bed and looked at the turned earth and the careful rows she'd made and said, You've done this before. My mother had a kitchen garden, she said without looking up. In Poland, very small, but she grew more in it than seemed possible. What did she grow? Everything, Anya said. Beets, carrots, 3 kinds of herbs, onions. She patted the soil down over a row of seeds. She used to say that a woman who knew how to grow things would never be entirely at someone else's mercy. She sat back on her heels and looked at the bed. I believed her, but I was 18 when I left, and after that I was always in other people's kitchens, using other people's gardens. She paused. This is the first garden that's mine to tend. He crouched down beside her. The soil was good. He could see that. Dark and dense. The years of Margaret's composting evident in its texture. 2 women, different decades, different origins, and the soil between them. She'd be glad it's being used, he said. Anya looked at him. She understood who he meant. I think about that sometimes, she said, whether she'd mind. No, he said. He said it with certainty, because he knew it with certainty, not in a way that discounted the grief, but in a way that honored what Margaret had actually been. A woman who believed houses were for people and that empty things were a waste. She wouldn't mind. Anya nodded. She went back to the seeds. He stayed beside her for a while, not helping. She didn't need help. She was precise and systematic and had a plan, but present. Just there. Which he was beginning to understand was its own thing, being present without needing to be useful. And it was something he was getting better at slowly, the way you get better at things that don't come naturally by practicing them anyway. The seeds went in. She marked the rows with small sticks and a bit of twine. He helped with that part, holding the twine while she measured. It took an hour and a half, and afterward she stood and pressed her hands into her lower back and said, That's done. It'll be a good garden, he said. She looked at it. It will, she said, with the satisfaction of someone who has made something with their hands and knows it was made well. They went inside. She washed her arms at the basin and he made coffee, which he'd started doing sometimes in the afternoons when the reports were done, and there was a lull before the evening's work. She came to the table and sat, and he brought 2 cups, and they sat in the late afternoon light with the garden outside and the house around them and the spring making its careful way through the territory. Muriel wants you to visit, he said. I know, Anya said. I'm going Tuesday. She's going to ask you to make that soup again. I know that too. She drank her coffee. I don't mind. He looked at her across the table. The light was doing the thing it had started doing in March, lasting longer, reaching further into the room. It was good light. Are you happy? He said. She looked at him. The question surprised her. He could see that. Not because it was an unreasonable question, but because she was a person who didn't spend much time accounting for her own happiness, who had spent so long managing survival that the question had become almost theoretical. She thought about it. He watched her actually think about it, not deflect it, not give him the convenient answer. Think about it. Yes, she said. Not the easy kind. Not the kind that doesn't know anything yet. She looked at her hands around the cup. The kind that has cost something. Which is the only kind I trust. He nodded. That's the kind I have too, he said. She met his eyes. I know, she said. They drank their coffee. Outside, the wind moved through the new grass at the edge of the property, the grass that came up every year whether anyone tended it or not, persistent and unasked for, and exactly what it was. The last piece of this winter's business resolved itself in a way that Everett hadn't planned and couldn't have. It was Aldrich Holt who came to him, not the other way around. He came on a Wednesday evening in the third week of April, and he came to the house, which was not where he'd come before. He'd always made a point of meeting Everett on official territory, at the jailhouse or the town hall, the geography of authority. Coming to the house was a different gesture, and they both knew it. Anya answered the door. There was a moment, a real one, with genuine awkwardness on Holt's side that Everett, watching from across the room, found unexpectedly human, where the mayor of Harland Ridge stood on the porch and looked at the woman he had spent the winter trying to remove and had to decide what his face was going to do. He said, Miss Novak. She said, Mayor Holt. I'd like to speak with the marshal, he said, if it's convenient. She stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. I'll get coffee. He came in. He sat at the table that Everett gestured him toward. Anya put coffee in front of him and then, without being asked and without making a point of it, went to the back of the house, giving them the room. Holt watched her go. Something in his face registered the courtesy of that. She didn't have to do that, he said. No, Everett said. She didn't. Holt looked at his coffee. He was a man who prepared speeches, who organized his thoughts formally before delivering them, and Everett waited for the organized version. What came instead was something less organized, which suggested that what he'd prepared and what he actually needed to say were different things. I've been thinking about this winter, Holt said. Everett said nothing. I've been thinking about what I did, Holt said, and I want to be honest with you, Everett, because we've known each other long enough for that. I thought I was protecting something. I believed that. He paused. I'm not sure I was wrong to be concerned. I'm sure I was wrong about how I handled the concern. He stopped again. That letter I showed Pruitt, that was a mistake. I knew it when I did it, and I told myself it was justified. Everett looked at him. Was that an apology or a position statement? Holt looked up. The red face, the familiar expression. Both, he said. Probably. Aldrich, Everett said. What do you actually want to say? A long pause, the longest Holt had given him in their 11 years of knowing each other. She's a decent woman, Holt said finally. I watched this winter. I watched what she did with the Calloway woman and the Henderson children and Muriel Strand, who doesn't like anybody, and I watched what the town started to do once people had actual information instead of what I gave them. He looked at his hands around the cup. I could have stopped it. I had enough information early on. I didn't stop it because I'd already committed to a position and I didn't want to look wrong. He said that last sentence with the specific difficulty of a man who is not accustomed to saying the truest thing about himself. That's not something I'm proud of. Everett sat with that for a moment. He thought about what to do with a powerful man's genuine admission, which was rarer than a powerful man's apology, because admissions required a specific kind of vulnerability that apologies could sometimes avoid. I appreciate you saying it, he said. She deserves to hear it, Holt said. Everett looked at him. Then you should say it to her. Holt's expression moved through several things. Then he said, yes, I should. He didn't immediately move to do it, and Everett didn't push because there was value in the man sitting with his own commitment for a minute before acting on it. Then Holt stood up. He went to the back of the house. He knocked on the door of the room where Anya had gone. Everett didn't follow. He sat at the table and drank his coffee and listened to the house. And he heard Holt's voice, low and formal, and then Anya's voice, and then a longer silence, and then the sound of the door. Holt came back. His face was composed, but the composure was doing more work than usual. She said thank you, he said. What else did she say? Everett asked, a small pause. She said she understood that it was difficult, and that she hoped this winter would be the last time I decided what someone deserved before I'd met them. Holt stood near the door with his hat in his hands. She said it quietly, which was more uncomfortable than if she'd said it loudly. Yes, Everett said. That's how she is. Holt nodded. He turned to go, and then stopped with his hand on the door. You did right by her, he said. Not warmly. Holt was not a warm man and never had been. But honestly, in the register of a man who gives credit only when he believes it is precisely deserved. I didn't think so at the time. I think so now. Thank you, Aldrich, Everett said. Holt left. The door closed. Everett sat at the table for a moment, and then Anya came back into the kitchen. She sat across from him and picked up her cold coffee and drank it without comment. You all right? He said. Yes, she said. She thought about it an extra second. That was harder than Pruitt, she said, because Pruitt is young. Holt chose it, each step. She set the cup down. But he came. He didn't have to come. No, Everett said. He didn't. She looked at the table. People are more complicated than the worst thing they do, she said. I used to believe differently. I'm not sure I do anymore. He looked at her. When did you change your mind? She looked up at him. Somewhere around November, she said, when a man I'd never met put money on a train ticket for a woman he had no reason to trust. He held her gaze. That was a practical decision, he said. I know, she said. That's what made me trust it. Outside, the spring evening was coming down slow and clear over the territory, the kind of evening that felt, after a winter like the one they'd had, almost extravagant in its mildness. The light was lasting past 6 now, edging toward 7, and the air through the window that she'd cracked open an inch smelled like turned earth and new grass and the particular cleanness of a world that had been cold a long time and was now, reluctantly and with no guarantee of permanence, beginning to warm. This was what they had built. Not quickly, not easily, not without cost. A place where two people who had both learned to expect very little from the ordinary circumstances of living had found that the ordinary circumstances could, under the right conditions, and with the right amount of stubbornness, become something you would choose on purpose, not a fairy tale. Everett was 51, with bad knees and a complicated relationship with his own silence, and a tendency to deal with difficult emotions by fixing things that didn't need fixing. Anya was 29, with a past that would probably follow her for years, and a sharpness to her that could cut when she wasn't careful, and a grief for her father and her mother's kitchen garden and the girl she'd been in Warsaw that she would be carrying for the rest of her life. They were going to argue. They were going to misunderstand each other. There were going to be mornings when the winter felt closer than the spring, but the boards were on the path. The south beds were planted. The porch railing was solid. The back bedroom had been aired and cleaned, and the quilt on the bed was fresh. The house had a garden that was tended and a woodpile that was properly stacked, and a lamp in the window by 6 o'clock, and soup that took skills 2 generations of women had passed down through hard winters in another country. And there was a man at the table who had put money on a train ticket for a woman he didn't know, not because he was a hero, not because he was uncomplicated, not because he knew how it would end, but because she'd answered his advertisement and her letter was tired, and he knew the difference between a person with something to hide and a person who was simply done. And there was a woman across from him who had said, "All right," twice, and meant it both times more completely than most people meant the large words. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was in fact exactly the right amount of everything, imperfect and specific and chosen, which is the only kind of life that is actually worth the living. Anya reached across the table and refilled his cup from the pot she'd left there. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome." The lamp was on. The evening was coming in through the window, slow and good, over the frontier, over the garden, over the house that had been empty for 3 years and would not be empty again. Outside, in the south beds, in the dark soil that one woman had built and another had planted, small things were already beginning, invisibly and without ceremony, to grow.